In the ruins of a world consumed by war, there are stories not found in textbooks, but whispered in locked rooms and sealed files. Fragments of transmissions, crates buried in darkness, operations erased from memory, each one a splinter of a truth too dangerous to surface. These are not tales of victory or defeat, but of shadows where science, secrecy, and desperation collided. Step closer, and the silence of forgotten archives begins to speak. In the final weeks of the Second World War, as Germany's collapsing front crumbled under the combined weight of Soviet and Allied offensives, events in Lower Silesia were unfolding that would never appear in official Wehrmacht communiques. What remained of the German High Command had ordered a scorched earth policy across the eastern provinces. And yet, scattered reports suggest a parallel initiative: the concealment of experimental research and strategic documents in sealed underground caches. These sites, known internally under the codename Ashen, literally Ashen Chamber, would, decades later, be whispered about by archivists and dismissed by mainstream historians as myth. But traces remain, enough to piece together a fragmented narrative of what may have been hidden beneath the soil of Silesia in 1945. By early February of that year, Soviet forces had already crossed the Oder and threatened the industrial hubs of Breslau, now Wrocław. Intelligence files recovered from the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz record that an SS engineering detachment, commanded by Obersturmführer Klaus Henninger of the 31st SS Pioneer Battalion, was diverted from regular demolition work to a classified project inside the Soe Mountains, southeast of Breslau. Witnesses described convoys of heavy trucks, escorted by Feldgendarmerie, moving in darkness and unloading into abandoned mining shafts. A Czech forced laborer later debriefed by the NKVD described seeing containers of unusual steel, larger than coffins, stenciled with numbers and strange symbols, lowered into shafts by chain hoists before entrances were blasted shut with dynamite. These accounts align with intercepted German radio traffic preserved in Soviet GRU files, particularly a series of transmissions between Stab Henninger and a Berlin control office labeled Amt 6F, a subsection of the Reich Main Security Office concerned with foreign intelligence. In one such intercept, dated 3rd of March 1945, reference is made to U-Elemente, Brennmaterial, Blaupausen, Verräterlisten, uranium elements, fuel stocks, blueprints, and lists of traitors. Whether these phrases referred to actual materials or were coded references remains unresolved. But the specificity of the language has fueled speculation among intelligence historians that nuclear-related assets were among the buried cargo. After the fall of Breslau on 6th of May 1945, Soviet engineering units combed the surrounding region for evidence of concealed German depots. Reports within the Ministry of Internal Affairs, later declassified during the Gorbachev era, mention at least 3 shafts near Walbazich being located but deemed structurally unsafe for entry. A technical note from Colonel V. Karpov of the 1st Guards Army states, "Mine number 27, sealed by concrete and detonation, emits faint electrical resonance when approached with detection apparatus. Entrance impassable." The phrase electrical resonance has been interpreted by later researchers as a mistranslation of Geiger counter anomalies, though the Soviet documents are frustratingly vague. In 1952, Polish state mining enterprises attempted to reopen several galleries in the Ural Mountains region, ostensibly to reclaim industrial metal. Miners reported hearing metallic ringing from within blocked tunnels, and one anonymous foreman submitted a note, preserved today in the Wrocław Voivodeship Archive, describing sealed galleries humming with power. Warsaw immediately classified the report and forbade further exploration, citing risk of collapse. The prohibition order bore the stamp Geheime Reichssache, a German classification marking found curiously on a Polish state file, suggesting the document may have originated from confiscated Nazi paperwork reused in bureaucratic circulation. The legend of Ashen resurfaced again in the 1960s during NATO intelligence assessments of Soviet clandestine mining operations in Poland. British SIS memoranda noted unusual activity around former Wehrmacht facilities near Schwiednica, where Soviet geological teams conducted surveys under military guard. Analysts speculated that Moscow continued to search for hidden Nazi caches long after official interest should have waned. One MI6 field officer wrote in a 1964 cable, "The Soviets dig not for coal, but for ghosts." Attempts to verify the existence of the Ashen Vault have consistently failed. In 1977, Polish dissident historian Marek Nowak published excerpts of a document allegedly recovered from the Central Committee archives, listing the inventory of containers buried in March 1945. The items included Project Storch navigation systems, uranium oxide canisters, prototype acoustic torpedoes, and dossiers on defectors to the Allies. Within weeks, Nowak was arrested, his works confiscated, and he was sentenced to 5 years for anti-state propaganda. Upon his release in 1982, he denied ever writing the document, claiming it had been fabricated by the security services to entrap him. Yet copies of the inventory list continued to circulate in samizdat form, ensuring the myth of the vault survived. Even in reunified Germany, the files remain elusive. In 1995, a joint Polish-German archaeological project attempted to survey the suspected mine sites using ground-penetrating radar. The team reported anomalous reflections consistent with sealed cavities, but excavation permits were abruptly withdrawn after intervention from the Polish Ministry of Defense. When journalists inquired, they were told the sites lay on unstable geological fault lines. No further explanation was offered. The case of Operation Ashen Vault endures in fragments. Soviet intercepts mentioning coded cargo, testimonies of miners, classified orders bearing German stamps in Polish archives, and the persistent refusal of governments to allow thorough investigation. What precisely Obersturmführer Henninger's detachment buried remains unknown, whether weapons technology, sensitive intelligence files, or nothing more than administrative archives intended to delay Allied discovery. The documents that do exist, stamped with fading ink and heavy redactions, suggest something was sealed deliberately and with great care in those final chaotic weeks of the Reich. The fate of Henninger himself adds to the mystery. Post-war trials in Nuremberg never mentioned his name, and Allied occupation rosters list him as missing, presumed dead. Yet a CIA field report from Vienna in 1951 claims an informant recognized Henninger living under an assumed identity, working as a mining engineer in Innsbruck. The report was archived, then declassified decades later with the notation, "unable to confirm." If true, it would mean that the officer who orchestrated Aschenkammer escaped justice, carrying with him the knowledge of what exactly was entombed beneath Silesia's soil. To this day, the so-called Operation Ashen Vault remains one of the enduring shadows of World War II, an unfinished chapter buried under layers of rock, bureaucracy, and secrecy. Researchers, treasure hunters, and intelligence veterans continue to speculate, yet the silence of the archives is almost total. What was interred in the Owl Mountains in March 1945 may never be unearthed, unless some future excavation dares to break the seal of the Ashen Chamber and expose the truth that was meant to be forgotten. In the bleak winter of 1942, as convoys struggled through Arctic storms to deliver vital supplies to the Soviet Union, an operation unfolded along the Kola Peninsula that would remain unacknowledged by Britain's Admiralty for decades. The Allied lifeline, convoy routes from Scotland and Iceland to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, was among the most dangerous assignments of the war, constantly shadowed by German U-boats, menaced by Luftwaffe bombers from occupied Norway, and threatened by surface raiders such as the battleship Tirpitz. The losses mounted with each passing month. In response, a classified British initiative sought to turn the very seabed into a weapon of detection. The project bore the codename Snowglass. British records that survived the war suggest Snowglass was conceived within the Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a bureau known for experimental projects outside traditional naval doctrine. The concept was audacious. Bury magnetic detection grids beneath the permafrost of the Kola Peninsula, linking them to concealed listening huts that could track U-boat movements through disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field. By early 1942, with Stalin demanding greater protection for the convoys, the plan gained urgency. SIS officers in neutral Sweden facilitated preliminary geological surveys, smuggling data on the Arctic seabed through diplomatic pouches. Deployment began in late November 1942. A Royal Navy technical unit, operating undercover as a meteorological survey team, sailed aboard HMS Milne to Murmansk, where Soviet authorities permitted limited access to the Kola coast. Construction crews, drawn from the Special Signal Service and reinforced by Canadian engineers familiar with Arctic conditions, established outposts disguised as weather shacks near Cape Sviatoy Nos and Rybachi Peninsula. Each contained crude generators, magnetic anomaly detectors, and field teleprinters connected to Murmansk via Soviet-operated landlines. The Soviet NKVD provided official oversight, but was not briefed on the true purpose of the installations. Field diaries later smuggled into Norwegian archives after the war describe the conditions. Lieutenant Arthur Wexford of the Royal Signals wrote on 12 December 1942, "Temperature 31, equipment frosting, detectors unstable, Soviet liaison officer inspects daily, suspects our role but lacks technical grasp. We monitor 24 hours, burst detected consistent with magnetic signature of submarine passage." Wexford's journal, now catalogued in Oslo as SNGL 42-3, is one of the few first-hand accounts of snowglass operations to survive. By spring 1943, the array was reportedly functioning. A declassified Norwegian intelligence memo from 1951 refers cryptically to British acoustic magnetic outposts near Murmansk, which, in at least 2 incidents, provided advance warning of enemy submarine concentration. Convoy PQ-17, which suffered catastrophic losses in July 1942, had no such benefit, but later convoys, notably JW-53 in February 1943, arrived with far fewer losses than expected. Historians attribute this improvement to improved escort tactics, yet the possibility that snowglass relays provided unseen assistance lingers in the shadows of the record. The project's secrecy soon generated friction. By late 1943, the Soviets had grown increasingly suspicious of the facilities, especially as Red Army counterintelligence uncovered instances of unauthorized Allied radio traffic emanating from British huts. A fragmentary NKVD report preserved in Moscow states, "Outposts constructed by English contain machinery inconsistent with meteorological purpose. It is possible they monitor Red Fleet movement." The Soviets demanded explanations, but the Admiralty denied any espionage role, framing the outposts as experimental navigation beacons. Tensions simmered until the end of the war. What became of snowglass after 1945 is less clear. Some records indicate that British personnel dismantled their equipment in haste as relations with the USSR deteriorated. A 1947 Foreign Office file references recovery of magnetic apparatus from Arctic stations, but the pages following are redacted. Other accounts claim the Soviets seized remaining installations intact, reverse engineering the technology for their own counter-submarine network during the Cold War. Supporting this theory, a 1962 CIA analysis of Soviet naval developments notes, "Magnetic anomaly detection equipment, unusually advanced given domestic research trajectory," a phrasing many interpret as evidence of British origin. The most troubling aspect lies in the deliberate erasure of snowglass from official Admiralty records. By 1947, all wartime references to the project had been struck from operational summaries. Requests for information by researchers in the 1970s were met with the response that no such program existed. Yet Norwegian archives, declassified after 1991, retain cables sent from London to Norwegian intelligence officers during the war, referring directly to snowglass. One such cable, dated 6th January 1943, states, "Snowglass functional. Reliability limited by frost. Continue surveillance of German flotilla Trondheim." The reason for the erasure remains speculative. One possibility is that the British feared exposure of surveillance against Soviet naval forces, even while allied with Moscow. Another is the embarrassment of having engaged in an expensive experiment that yielded ambiguous results, or, more ominously, that Snowglass did detect more than German submarines, that it uncovered Soviet fleet movements deliberately monitored without Kremlin knowledge. If true, it would represent one of the earliest clandestine breaches of Allied trust during the war, foreshadowing the espionage conflicts that defined the Cold War. Today, fragments of the project remain scattered. Lieutenant Wexford's diary in Oslo, a handful of cables in Norwegian intelligence archives, Soviet counterintelligence, notes in Moscow, and redacted Admiralty files in London. Together, they sketch the outline of an operation born in secrecy, buried in bureaucracy, and erased from official memory. Along the desolate coast of the Kola Peninsula, traces of those listening posts may still lie beneath the permafrost, their wires corroded but intact, mute testimony to a forgotten chapter of wartime intelligence. The Murmansk listening posts of Project Snowglass remain suspended between rumor and record. Did they save convoys or betray secrets to the Soviets? Were they dismantled quietly or incorporated into the Soviet submarine defense net that later frustrated NATO patrols? The archives refuse to give a definitive answer. What can be said with certainty is that, in the Arctic silence of 1942, far from London's eyes, Britain planted its hidden ears in Soviet soil and has spent the decades since pretending they never existed. As the Allied armies advanced into Bavaria in the spring of 1945, intelligence officers tasked with securing Nazi scientific research stumbled upon an anomaly, a cluster of facilities bearing insignia not tied to any known Wehrmacht division or SS command. The structures, low, nondescript concrete bunkers and a camouflaged hangar near Augsburg, were largely abandoned, their personnel scattered. But inside lay crates of documentation marked with a simple symbol, the Greek letter Epsilon, painted in black on white backgrounds. These files would later be catalogued by the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, as the Epsilon Papers, a term still whispered among archivists as shorthand for one of the most opaque recoveries of the war. The first discovery occurred on 26 April 1945, when the US 3rd Infantry Division seized an airfield outside Augsburg. In the operations log of the 179th Regiment, an entry notes, "Secured compound contains unusual lab equipment, no aircraft present. Documents seized." Those documents included schematic diagrams for Strahlsteuerung, beam guidance systems, designed to control aerial munitions remotely. The signatures on the papers linked them not to established firms like Messerschmitt or Siemens, but to shell companies registered in Berlin under SS cover. CIC interrogators soon determined that the project had operated under a hybrid structure. Industrial scientists subcontracted through IG Farben subsidiaries, guarded by SS Totenkopfverbände, and reporting to an administrative bureau not listed in Reich organizational charts. The files also contained extensive labor rosters, hundreds of prisoner names, mostly Eastern Europeans, cross-referenced with camp designations. Strikingly, many of these prisoners could not be traced to surviving camp records after 1945. The absence suggests deliberate erasure, consistent with the last-minute liquidation policies of the SS. One folder, labeled Versuchspersonen 17 to 44, listed dates of death, but the cause column was left blank. Testimony from a Czech survivor, recorded in 1946 in Prague, spoke of being transferred briefly to the Epsilon compound near Augsburg, where prisoners were forced to assemble antenna arrays and test radio equipment at night. He claimed, "Those who fell ill were taken away in lorries and never returned." In Washington, the captured documents were shuttled into the Pentagon's Technical Industrial Intelligence Committee, TIIC. An internal memo dated 14 July 1945 describes the Epsilon papers as unusually sensitive, containing both advanced technical designs and politically compromising records of Allied defectors. That last phrase, Allied defectors, has fueled decades of speculation. The redacted portions of the memo, where names should appear, remain withheld even after partial declassification in the 1990s. Researchers argue this suggests individuals within Allied nations who may have collaborated with the Nazis in clandestine weapons research, a revelation explosive enough to demand continued suppression. The Augsburg facilities themselves were destroyed shortly after the war. A US Army engineering unit demolished the hangar in 1946, citing structural instability, though aerial reconnaissance from late 1945 shows the buildings intact. Local Bavarian police records indicate civilians were forbidden to approach the site, even years after its abandonment. By 1952, all traces of Unit Epsilon's compounds had been erased, the land resettled for agriculture. Inquiries into Unit Epsilon have faced obstruction. In 1957, journalist Harold Winters attempted to publish a feature in Collier's Weekly based on leaked CIC transcripts referencing Epsilon. The article was pulled hours before print, and Winters was reportedly visited by Defense Department officials. A year later, he left journalism entirely. Declassified FOIA releases decades later reveal why. Winters had obtained fragments describing US attempts to integrate certain Epsilon scientists into Operation Paperclip. The documents show at least 3 unnamed engineers were flown to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, though their subsequent fate remains sealed. By the late 1960s, references to Unit Epsilon had almost vanished. Only occasional slips in archival indexes, folders marked E in Pentagon microfilms, or stray cables in British intelligence logs kept the trail alive. One British SIS note from November 1945, however, hints at the transnational dimensions. Epsilon files contain reference to beam control system trialed over channel. Implication that Allied aircraft compromised during late 1944. This suggests that German research into guidance beams may have contributed to unexplained Allied aircraft losses in Western Europe during the war's final months. Survivor testimony continues to cast shadows over the story. In 1979, a Polish émigré engineer claimed during an interview in Chicago that he had been forced to calibrate guidance transmitters for Unit Epsilon in underground tunnels beneath Augsburg. He described maps of England pinned to walls, with chalk lines showing arcs of transmission. His claims could not be corroborated, yet his technical descriptions of beam control matched fragments from declassified Luftwaffe documents. What haunts researchers most are the prisoner lists, the blank cause of death columns, the erased names from surviving camp rolls, and the lack of graves all point toward an unrecorded atrocity. Unlike the mass exterminations at Auschwitz or Treblinka, Unit Epsilon's victims vanished into a bureaucratic void, their lives consumed by an experimental project that history never officially acknowledged. Their absence is the truest shadow cast by Epsilon, not just suppressed technology, but erased humanity. Today, the Epsilon papers remain sequestered in restricted archives. Requests for full access under FOIA continue to be denied on grounds of national security. The surviving files are heavily redacted, with entire sections whited out, leaving only fragments. Beam frequency, transmitter array, Augsburg South compound, subject mortality, classified. The absence of closure ensures the persistence of rumor. Was Unit Epsilon merely an experimental radio guidance program, hastily abandoned, or was it a nexus where advanced science, political betrayal, and war crimes converged, buried deliberately to shield both victors and vanquished? Shadows of Unit Epsilon remain, appropriately, shadows. No monument marks the site near Augsburg. The archives offer only silence broken by fragments. And yet, in those fragments, technical sketches, labor rosters, redacted names, one glimpses the outline of a chapter that official history has tried hard to erase, but which refuses to disappear. In the autumn of 1943, after Italy's surrender and the rapid German occupation of the Dalmatian coast, British intelligence began to receive fragmentary reports of unusual naval activity among the Adriatic islands. Italian naval defectors, interrogated in Bari and Taranto, described German efforts to establish a concealed base for a new type of submarine, smaller than a U-boat, but capable of extended submerged operations. Enigma intercepts out of the Kriegsmarines. Mediterranean Command referred cryptically to Seeschlange, sea serpent, a term that did not match any known German designation. It was this name that entered Allied situation reports, always flagged with question marks in the margins. The first concrete lead appeared in a decrypted message dated 11 November 1943, addressed to Naval Command South in La Spezia. It ordered supplies and oxygen tanks for Seeschlange project, Island Sector F. Allied analysts could not identify Sector F, but Italian informants suggested it pointed to the scattered coves around the island of Vis, long used as hidden anchorages. British commanders, already stretched thin protecting convoys in the central Mediterranean, nonetheless authorized reconnaissance. RAF Coastal Command flights out of Brindisi reported unusual camouflage netting along the cliffs of several small islets, though no vessels were spotted. By December, intelligence urgency grew. Reports from Yugoslav partisan couriers smuggled into Bari described long, narrow boats towed at night into limestone caverns near Lastovo. One partisan sketch, preserved today in the Imperial War Museum, shows a half-submerged tunnel opening guarded by flak batteries. The Royal Navy suspected the Germans were testing a prototype submersible capable of ambushing Allied convoys moving toward Ancona or Bari. The hypothesis aligned with mounting losses. Several freighters vanished without distress calls, their positions consistent with a stealthy attacker operating from within the Adriatic rather than the open sea. On 8 January 1944, Special Air Service Detachment Archer was briefed at Bari. Composed of 12 men under Captain Robert M. Harding, their mission was to infiltrate the Dalmatian coast, confirm the existence of Seeschlange, and, if possible, sabotage the E base. The orders, stamped most secret, not to be filed, survive only in a single carbon copy retrieved from a declassified SOE folder. Harding's men sailed under cover of darkness aboard a modified fishing vessel. They never returned. German records captured after the war make no mention of Archer's raid, but they do contain curious entries. A Kriegsmarine supply ledger, dated February 1944, lists allocations of compressed oxygen cylinders, electrical accumulators, and torpedo heads to Baugruppe S. The destination is given only as Adriatic sector. Analysts note the ledger's handwriting differs from standard naval clerks, perhaps suggesting an SS-administered program. In parallel, an intercepted message from Berlin to Admiral Dönitz refers obliquely to our Serpent, still unproven, but valuable for post-war evaluation. When the war ended, investigators combed Yugoslav coastal archives for evidence. In 1946, Tito's government permitted British naval officers to tour former German installations. On Lastovo, they found collapsed cavern entrances littered with rusting machinery, winches, flooded rail tracks, and steel fittings. The dimensions suggested the handling of vessels smaller than conventional U-boats. A classified British Admiralty report, filed as ADM 223411, concluded, evidence consistent with maintenance of miniature submarine flotilla, potentially advanced design, no surviving craft located. The report was buried, not released until 1995. In the 1950s, rumors surfaced among Yugoslav divers of sealed tunnels along the island of Millet. Some claim to have glimpsed metallic hull fragments deep underwater, trapped behind rockfalls. These stories reached NATO naval intelligence, which conducted a discreet survey in 1957. Divers reported no findings, but a marginal note in the survey log reads, "Local claims of strange machinery credible. Recommend continued monitoring." By then, the Cold War had shifted priorities. NATO feared Soviet submarine deployments in the Adriatic, not relics of the Kriegsmarine. The unresolved element remains the vessel itself. What was Seeschlange? Some naval historians argue it was a German adaptation of the Italian CA-class midget submarine, fitted with experimental closed-cycle propulsion to extend underwater endurance. Others suggest it was a stepping stone toward the Type X-6 Walter submarines, powered by hydrogen peroxide, projects known to have been in development at Kiel. The Adriatic base, remote and defensible, would have offered the perfect testing. Ground far from Allied bomber ranges. The fate of Harding's SAS detachment adds another layer of silence. Post-war casualty lists mark all 12 as missing, presumed killed Adriatic operations. No German unit claimed their capture, and no graves were ever found. A 1948 CIC interview with a former SS officer stationed in Split contains a tantalizing fragment. "We caught English saboteurs once, sent them to the Serpent's Island. They never came back." Whether this was boastful invention or a veiled reference to Archer remains unanswered. Modern attempts to re-examine the Adriatic submersible mystery face political and physical barriers. Many of the suspected cave sites lie in restricted military zones or have collapsed. Archival files remain heavily redacted in both London and Belgrade, citing operational sensitivity. Even German records are thin, suggesting deliberate destruction. Yet enough fragments survive. The ledger entries, the partisan sketch, the abandoned machinery, and the missing SAS patrol. Together, they form the outline of a story suppressed at the intersection of wartime secrecy and post-war politics. The Germans may have tested a weapon years ahead of its time, hidden in the limestone labyrinth of the Dalmatian coast. Whether the craft escaped to Soviet hands, was scuttled in deep water, or lies entombed behind rockfalls remains unknown. The silence surrounding Seeschlanger has endured for more than 70 years, a silence broken only by the waves crashing against the deserted cliffs of the Adriatic. In the chaotic final days of the Third Reich, as Soviet forces pressed toward Königsberg and the Baltic coast, a vast naval evacuation unfolded under the codename Operation Hannibal. Between January and May 1945, over 2 million German soldiers and civilians fled aboard Kriegsmarine vessels. Amid the confusion of these convoys, survivors reported a disturbing anomaly. A flotilla of transports sailing without lights, escorted by destroyers that bore no registry or markings. The ships were never listed on official manifests. Eyewitnesses later insisted they carried not refugees, but sealed cargo, crates stenciled with scientific symbols and glass cylinders. This phantom formation became known among Allied intelligence officers as the Ghost Convoy. The first credible mention appears in a Royal Navy intercept log dated 22 April 1945. A listening station on Bornholm captured bursts of encrypted traffic tagged Sigma handle. The cipher team, struggling with collapsing German codes, noted the frequency match transmissions used by Dönitz's headquarters at Plön. The decrypted fragments remain fragmentary. Cargo, priority, must not fall into enemy hands. Hours later, civilian witnesses on the island of Rügen reported seeing a line of ships slipping through fog without navigation lights, their destroyer escorts using only signal lamps shielded from shore. Survivors from the steamer Pretoria, sunk days later, described overhearing German sailors whispering about a convoy for the scientists. Captured German naval records should have clarified the matter, but instead, they deepen the mystery. Kriegsmarine war diaries for April 1945 make no mention of Sigma Handel. Pages covering the relevant dates were either destroyed or replaced, with retyped sheets lacking signatures. Yet in 1946, British investigators found a requisition order signed by Kapitän zur See Wilhelm Meisel, allocating extra fuel and food for special convoy destination Baltic sector. The convoy's ships were not named, only grouped under the abbreviation GH. Analysts in Whitehall speculated this stood for Geheimer Handelstransport, secret trade transport. Testimony from refugees further corroborates the anomaly. In 1947, during displaced persons interviews in Lübeck, a Polish survivor recalled being turned away from boarding a vessel in Gotenhafen because it was reserved for cargo. She described watching soldiers load heavy crates marked with hazard symbols and Latin letters she did not understand. Another account, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, records a German sailor confessing to ferrying sealed glass containers packed in straw aboard an unmarked transport. He claimed officers warned the crew that breaking a seal meant instant execution. The fate of the convoy remains obscure. No wrecks have been conclusively identified, despite the thousands of German ships lost in the Baltic. Soviet naval files, partially declassified in the 1970s, contain repeated references to unusual traffic around Bornholm in April 1945. One report from Admiral Tribets, commander of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, notes, "Enemy convoy, no lights, avoided contact, presumed evacuation attempt, pursuit impossible due to minefields." Later annotations in red pencil add, "Speculation, material cargo of scientific importance." Whether Soviet forces engaged or merely observed is unclear. Notably, Moscow's post-war propaganda never mentioned capturing such a convoy, a silence uncharacteristic of their usual boasting. By 1948, the Ghost Convoy had entered NATO intelligence law. A declassified CIA memorandum from 1952 refers to persistent rumors of Nazi scientific cargo evacuated by sea, April 1945, possibly involving atomic material. The memo concludes with the chilling line, "If convoy destroyed, wreck location unknown. If captured, Soviets have concealed." British files echo this suspicion. An MI6 report from the same year describes a source in Warsaw who claimed Soviet divers located a sunken German transport off Kolobrzeeg, carrying sealed cylinders, emitting radiation. The source died in a car crash weeks later. The enigma drew renewed attention during the Cold War. In 1968, the US Navy's submarine USS Tigrone conducted clandestine sonar mapping of the Baltic floor. A classified operations log, later leaked, describes large anomalous metallic structures at depth 250 feet, 40 nautical miles northeast of Bornholm. Officially, the anomalies were dismissed as wreckage from scuttled freighters. Yet a handwritten note in the margin, possibly GH Convoy, suggests otherwise. Speculation about the convoy's cargo has proliferated. Some historians argue it carried uranium oxide and reactor components intended for the aborted German atomic program. Others believe it contained biological warfare materials, including nerve agents like tabun, evidence of which Allied forces later discovered in hidden caches. A more conspiratorial theory holds that Sigma Handel represented the evacuation of sensitive intelligence archives, lists of Nazi collaborators in Allied nations, explaining why Western governments and the Soviets alike have kept the files sealed. What is known is that survivors of Hannibal convoys continued to whisper about the Ghost Fleet long after the war. Letters preserved in the personal collection of a German naval officer's widow mention the convoy that did not exist, that we escorted into fog and never saw again. Another, written by a British intelligence officer in 1949, notes, "We know they sailed. We do not know where they landed, if at all." The Ghost Convoy of the Baltic remains an unsolved case, lodged between archival silence and survivor memory. Its ships appear in no logs, its cargo in no official inventories, its escorts in no fleet orders, yet fragments, intercepts, requisition slips, testimonies point to something real, something moved under cover of night as the Reich collapsed. Whether scuttled to the sea floor, captured by the Soviets, or spirited into secrecy by surviving Nazi networks, the convoy's fate is unresolved. The Baltic keeps its secrets well, and the Ghost Convoy sails there, still in the pages of the archives, a phantom of war that refuses to be laid to rest. The files close, the signals fade, but the questions remain. Somewhere in the darkness between history and myth, the fragments of these hidden stories still linger. Unclaimed wreckage, sealed tunnels, vanished names. They are the ghosts of a conflict that never truly ended, reminders that war leaves behind not only ruins, but secrets. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the silence was not meant to protect us from the past, but to prepare us for what still lies ahead.